Did Jesus ever actually say the words, "I am God"? It's one of the most debated questions in all of history. Many skeptics argue that Jesus never directly claimed to be God. Others insist that his divinity is at the very heart of Christianity. So who's right? Let's take a closer look at the arguments. Did Jesus truly claim to be God? Or did later followers put those words into his mouth? Today, we're exploring one of the most important questions ever asked. And the answer may be more complicated and more fascinating than many people realize. Welcome back to Sacred Questions, where we explore difficult questions about faith, God, the Bible, and Christianity with curiosity, honesty, and respect. Whether you're a committed Christian, a skeptic, someone questioning their faith, or simply curious about history, this conversation matters. Because if Jesus claimed to be God, that changes everything. It means Christianity isn't simply a moral philosophy or a collection of spiritual teachings. It means Jesus was making one of the most extraordinary claims any human being has ever made. But if he never claimed to be God, then one of Christianity's central beliefs deserves serious examination. So let's look at the evidence. Not through assumptions, not through slogans, but through the biblical texts, historical context, and the arguments on both sides. Let's begin with a point often raised by critics. Jesus never records himself saying the exact sentence, "I am God, worship me." And that's true, as many scholars and skeptics acknowledge. If we're looking for those precise words in the Bible, we won't find them. Because of this, some argue that Jesus saw himself merely as a prophet, teacher, or messenger of God. Others suggest that the belief in Jesus' divinity developed gradually after his death. According to this view, his followers increasingly elevated his status until he eventually became viewed as God himself. This argument has convinced many people because, on the surface, it seems straightforward. After all, if Jesus wanted everyone to know he was God, why didn't he simply say so in plain language? It's a fair question, one that deserves a thoughtful answer. But there's an important historical detail we need to understand. Jesus was speaking within a first-century Jewish culture, and in that culture, claims were often communicated very differently than they are today. To understand what Jesus was saying, we have to understand how his original audience understood him. Many Christians argue that Jesus absolutely claimed to be God, but he did so in ways that his Jewish audience would immediately recognize. Consider one famous example. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "Before Abraham was born, I am." At first glance, that statement may seem strange, but to many readers familiar with the Old Testament, it carries enormous significance. In the book of Exodus, when Moses asks God for his name, God responds, "I am who I am." The phrase "I am" became deeply associated with God's identity. When Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am," many scholars believe he is intentionally echoing that divine name. What's even more interesting is what happens next. According to the text, some listeners immediately pick up stones to kill him. Why? The Gospel suggests they viewed his statement as blasphemy, a claim to divine status. Another example appears when Jesus says, "I and the Father are one." Again, his opponents accuse him of blasphemy. In their understanding, Jesus was making himself equal with God. Now, some argue he meant unity of purpose rather than equality of nature. That's an ongoing debate, one that continues among scholars today. But what's undeniable is that many of his listeners understood him as making a profound claim about his relationship with God. Then there's the story of Thomas after the resurrection. When Thomas sees the risen Jesus, he responds, "My Lord and my God." Notably, Jesus does not correct him. For many Christians, this moment serves as one of the clearest affirmations of Jesus' divinity in the New Testament. There are other examples as well. Jesus forgives sins. In ancient Judaism, forgiveness of sins was ultimately understood as God's authority. When Jesus forgives sins directly, religious leaders ask, who can forgive sins but God alone? Jesus also accepts worship in multiple passages. Again, this is significant because throughout the Bible, worship belongs to God. Angels often refuse worship, prophets refuse worship, yet Jesus repeatedly receives it. Additionally, the opening of John's Gospel makes a remarkable declaration. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Gospel later identifies this word as Jesus. For Christians, these passages collectively create a powerful case that Jesus claimed a divine identity, not necessarily through modern language, but through actions, titles, authority, and statements that carried enormous theological meaning. So if the evidence seems strong, why does the debate continue? Partly because interpretation matters. It shapes how we see the evidence. Some scholars argue that many of these passages can be understood differently. For example, they suggest Jesus may have viewed himself as God's unique representative rather than God himself. Others point out that the Gospel of John contains the strongest divine claims and was written later than some other New Testament writings. Questions about translation, context, literary style, and theology all enter the discussion. And that's what makes this topic so fascinating. Reasonable people can examine the same texts and arrive at different conclusions. The question isn't merely what words Jesus spoke, it's what those words meant and how his earliest followers understood them. Yet it's also worth noting that very early Christian communities worshipped Jesus in ways that were extraordinary within a Jewish monotheistic framework. This suggests that belief in his divinity emerged remarkably early, not centuries later, as some popular theories claim. Perhaps the most interesting question isn't whether Jesus used a specific sentence. Perhaps the deeper question is, who did Jesus believe himself to be? And who do we believe he was? A great teacher? A prophet? A revolutionary? A misunderstood historical figure? Or something more? What makes Jesus unique is that his claims force a response. Many religious leaders point people toward truth. Jesus often pointed people toward himself. He didn't simply say, "Follow my teachings." He said, "Follow me." He didn't merely offer a path. He presented himself as central to that path. Whether one accepts his divinity or not, it's difficult to deny that Jesus made extraordinary claims about his identity and authority. And those claims continue to challenge humanity 2,000 years later. So what do you think? Did Jesus truly claim to be God? Or do you believe his words have been misunderstood over time? I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below. Let's keep the discussion thoughtful, respectful, and honest. If you enjoy exploring difficult questions about Christianity, faith, doubt, God, and the Bible, make sure to subscribe to Sacred Questions and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. And remember, some questions are too important not to ask. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.